Priscilla's Imitation is a channel that addresses errors of doctrine and practice in the church and culture. I'm Katherine Cardiff, a Christian seminary graduate, playing the role of Priscilla in Acts 18:26 to explain to you the way of God more adequately. As a brief recap of the Jesus Identity series, in Part 1 we previously heard my agnostic atheist cousin, Dylan Cardiff, share his tri-layered approach to the question of the identity of Jesus. From Dylan's perspective, Jesus' resurrection and deity are quite unlikely. Dylan entertained the possibility that Jesus was a myth, but he thought it was improbable. For the most part, Dylan accepts the idea that Jesus was merely a preacher in history who had legends build up about his identity posthumously. In Part 1, I focused on providing evidence that Jesus really existed as a person in history, so I refuted the idea that Jesus is a myth. In Part 2, we discussed the authenticity of Josephus' Testimonium Flavianum, which provides even more evidence that Jesus truly existed in history. In Part 3 of this series, I'll respond to one of Dylan's top 3 reasons for his current view of Jesus.
So number one always has to be for me the fact that I just never have seen anything to suggest that there might be supernatural thing going on in this world. There's some very interesting questions that people have asked epistemologically, like first cause arguments, like what is the first thing, what happened before the Big Bang, if that even makes sense to ask. And those are very interesting questions, but they're unanswered questions to me. I don't know the answer, and to posit something supernatural to me is not even really an answer. It's just kind of answering a question with a bigger question. So number one is I have never seen any evidence that anything like that exists. God's miracles, anything like that. No good evidence, I should say. I've seen some evidence, but it wasn't enough to convince me that it's very likely.
So by supernatural, you mean miracles kind of thing?
Yeah, miracles are one example, but other things that you would maybe not call a miracle would also be supernatural. I mean, like, to me, from an outside perspective, a werewolf and a miracle might be on the same level of like breaking the rules of what I think are hard rules that can't be broken. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think I understand that there are some rules in this world that can't be broken, and things that break those rules, not in a, like, we learned something new kind of way, but in like a, no, it's truly beyond this world, would be what I would call supernatural. Ghosts, miracles, all of that sort of thing. So that's my number one reason why I have the position I have. I would need some good evidence to overcome that barrier.
Dylan brings up an extremely significant topic. That is evidence of the supernatural. And as Dylan said in the interview, miracles fall into the category of the supernatural. As we'll see in a second, the topic of miracles is important to discuss for the sake of the salvation of unbelievers. By the way, throughout this episode, please pay attention to the screen to see when I'm directly quoting others. Dr. William Lane Craig is a Christian with more than one doctorate, and he astutely observes that undoubtedly one of the major stumbling blocks to becoming a Christian for many people today is that Christianity is a religion of miracles. It asserts that God became incarnate in Jesus of Nazareth, being born of a virgin, that he performed various miracles, exorcised demonic beings, and that, having died by crucifixion, he rose from the dead. But the problem is that these sorts of miraculous events seem to belong to a worldview foreign to modern man, a pre-scientific, superstitious worldview belonging to the ancient and Middle Ages. Craig is right that miracles are embedded within the very core of Christianity. Jesus' incarnation and resurrection are miracles themselves, and if someone disbelieves in those key events, they would not even be a Christian. Craig also observes that the modern-day non-Christian sees this miraculous Christian worldview in an outdated and negative way. It may seem to them that with scientific advances, a worldview that believes in miracles just doesn't make sense anymore. Dylan can probably sympathize with this view in some way, but I'm going to talk about the coexistence of science and miracles shortly. Craig presents the problem of miracles as a precursor issue to address. The thrust of Craig's point seems to be that we must establish the rationality of belief in miracles as an initial starting point prior to evaluating the keystone miraculous hallmarks of the Christian faith. This makes perfect sense. If every single miracle is outright impossible, then the Christian faith is a sham. It seems that Craig would not be surprised by Dylan's reservation about believing in miracles. For many people, it could be difficult to believe the supernatural claims that Jesus rose from the dead and that Jesus is God the Son if they live in a world that essentially lacks evidence of any kind of supernatural activity. And if Jesus never rose from the dead, there would be no reason to become a Christian. So the topic we're addressing today can have an eternal impact, since supernatural evidence has a bearing on the salvation of the lost. Again, today's topic is incredibly important for the sake of some unbelievers. It's also an important discussion topic for the sake of some believers. Randy Clark wrote about unbelieving believers present in large numbers in church who are skeptical of God's power for healing and miracles. Clark defines believers as church-going, spirit-regenerated Christ followers. So evidently, unbelieving believers are believers in Christ. They have received salvation through Jesus. Then in what sense are these people unbelieving? Clark explains that there are 5 gifts of the Spirit that this group of Christians don't believe in when it comes to modern-day church practice. And 2 of those 5 are healing and the working of miracles. So unbelieving believers have saving faith in Christ Jesus, but unbelief about some spiritual gifts. Therefore, there is a good deal of unbelief in the Christian church when it comes to the miraculous, not just unbelief among atheists. And I'm here to encourage both groups of people to re-examine your worldviews when it comes to the supernatural realm. If you're watching this episode as an unbelieving believer, I would encourage you to reread the New Testament and see if you can find a strong case for your beliefs on this topic from the New Testament itself. The miraculous is not only an important topic, but it's also a challenging topic. We're about to briefly discuss worldviews and deep skepticism, and both of these things can make miracles a challenging topic to discuss. Let's look at the impact of our worldviews. New Testament scholar Dr. Craig Keener indicates that for most Western observers, the interpreter's assumptions or presuppositions have a great impact on that person's tendency to attribute causes to natural or supernatural means. And I would have to agree. Things we already believe about the world will definitely impact how we view events and evidence. It's hard to escape our own worldview. Dylan and I are each coming to the discussion table with different worldviews. Part of Dylan's worldview is agnosticism and atheism, and part of my worldview is theism. Or to be more specific, I'm a follower of Christ who has prayed for people who have received healing. So Dylan and I are each bringing presuppositions with us as we examine what could be evidence for the miraculous. So different worldviews definitely make for a more challenging discussion. For everyone listening, as you hear the evidence I'll be presenting in upcoming episodes, keep in mind you're seeing it through the lens of your own worldview, and be ready for your worldview to be revolutionized. For some people, a deeply rooted skepticism can be part of their worldview, which can of course pose challenges for an open discussion on miracles. Keener points out that anti-supernaturalists demand a standard of evidence impossible for any position to meet, because evidence that contradicts one's position can virtually always be explained away. It's probably easy enough for any of us to fall prey to this, since if we have enough confidence in our own worldview, it would be hard to convince us to overturn our worldview by one piece of evidence, right? This would be especially true if changing our worldview involves a radical change of lifestyle. We all know that humans dislike change, right? It would be tempting to look for ways to preserve our own worldview while accommodating the presence of this one shred of evidence that seems to oppose it. So waving away evidence is reasonable if a person's goal is self-preservation or worldview preservation. But is it truly reasonable in the face of mounting evidence when a person genuinely wants to know the truth? If you're watching this and you're an anti-supernaturalist, please keep in mind that you may have already made my task in upcoming episodes impossible to accomplish, because you're ready to explain away any evidence I present that could potentially demonstrate the supernatural. My question for you is this: are you someone who genuinely wants to know the truth, even if it would mean change? All right, let me show you an extreme example of skepticism that Keener shares in his book, which drives home the point that skepticism poses a challenge for an open discussion on miracles. For 2 decades, one woman dealt with severe epilepsy and a brain disturbance, and then she obtained a normal EEG result after prayer. This is, by the way, based on Keener's summary of Ken Blue's description. The healthy result was hard for her doctors to accept, but in the end, the doctors, Ken says, have concluded that she must have been misdiagnosed and mistreated for the past 20 years. These conscientious and competent doctors have risked a possible malpractice suit rather than admit the possibility of divine healing. Whoa, that's pretty extreme. This account reveals how deeply entrenched skepticism can be. It suggests that some people are determined to cling to their skepticism no matter what it might cost them, even if it might cost them a lawsuit. Is skepticism really worth that price? It's time to be willing to let go of skepticism in situations like this. What if the past and present medical diagnoses were both correct? What if she really did have severe epilepsy and a brain disturbance before prayer? And what if her brain really was free of these issues after the prayer? We should not create a revisionist history of the medical evidence simply because all the evidence taken together does not fit our worldview. So now we've seen that the topic of miracles is both important and challenging, and we've seen how dangerous extreme skepticism can be. Now let's briefly talk about the relationship between science and miracles. First, I'll point out that Keener sees supernatural factors as outside the domain of science, beyond the reach of quantification. I've posted a quote from him on the screen. Indeed, if we're talking about what is passing through God's own mind, we have definitely surpassed the scientific realm. It's not hard to see that at least some aspect of the supernatural falls outside of science's purview. Additionally, Keener draws on insights beyond his own and seems to indicate that the inherent uniqueness of each miracle places miracles beyond the reach of controlled science experiments. This would make sense, right? Now listen closely. According to Keener, miracles are distinct acts in history. But at the same time, Keener still believes that miracle claims can be investigated by means of the appropriate methodology, one suited for individual events. Furthermore, Keener states that healing reports make claims about empirical reality that often can be tested, and hypotheses may be formed about their most plausible explanations. As a side note, that last statement will be especially relevant in the next episode when we discuss case studies from a research institute. So please remember Keener's comment about testing claims and making hypotheses. Anyway, if we accept Keener's view, we can see on the one hand that it is impossible for miracles to be fully investigated merely by the tools that science has to offer. But on the other hand, some aspects of certain miraculous claims do fall within the bounds of scientific inquiry. So if we imagine science and miracles as two circles, part of the circle of miracles would go beyond the circle of science. Within the miracle circle, there's a section we can label testable miracle claims. And this section of the miracle circle would overlap with the science circle. This overlapping region is where scientific inquiry can offer valuable input about testable miracle claims. Additionally, the science circle would also stretch beyond the bounds of the miracle circle. This is because we would not be tapping into every analytical tool that science has to offer, and we would be focusing on the individual event method of analysis. Keener himself does not present the image of circles, and it may well be an oversimplification, but hopefully it's a helpful way to visualize it. As a side note, even though it's best to study miracles as individual events, I still think there can be some value in doing randomized controlled studies with prayer as the independent variable, but I'm not going to go into the theological explanation for that right now. A randomized prayer study was just recently published, actually, but it has some design flaws that future studies can improve upon. Anyway, What else can be said about the relationship between science and miracles? Let me briefly give listeners a partial overview of my own background and perspective. First, let me say up front that I believe science and miracles can coexist. I got my bachelor's degree in neuroscience from UCLA. Dylan and I are actually both Bruins, and we had 1 year of overlap at UCLA before I graduated. I worked in neuroscience labs for 12 years. I also consider myself a Christian within the charismatic branch of the church. With all that in mind, I believe medical doctors and scientific research can be useful, and I also believe that God does miracles today and has done them in history. The validity and usefulness of medical advances does not eradicate the presence of the miraculous. The scientific method allows us to learn about the world that God created. We can embrace science without discarding miracles. So science and miracles can coexist. But can God work through science as well as working through miracles? Keener states that many cures stem from natural causes, even if, as most theists affirm, divine purpose stands somewhere behind nature. Right, as a theist myself, I would also affirm that. I believe we can see God's handiwork even when he works through natural processes, whether that is via the medical system or via the human body's built-in mechanisms of repair. After all, God is the one who created our bodies in the first place. God is the one who invented coagulation factors and antibodies, and I believe that God can work via doctors and medications too. So if someone gets healed through the power of the Holy Spirit, that's wonderful. But if someone gets healed through antibiotics that a doctor prescribed, that's good too. God can work via natural or supernatural methods. God can indeed work through science, and God can work through miracles. You don't have to agree with this, but right now I'm giving you some information about where I'm coming from. On this channel, in one sense, I'm presenting a bit of an academic approach, but in another sense, I'm not shying away from presenting a Christian perspective. Okay, now we've talked about how science and miracles can overlap and science and miracles can coexist. Hopefully this is a helpful framework for my science-minded listeners as we discuss miracles in upcoming episodes. Okay, let me sum things up a bit. The topic of miracles is important for evangelism to the unsaved, given that the core tenets of Christianity rest on the miraculous. This topic is also important for the sake of unbelieving believers in the Christian church. Miracles is also a challenging topic when people bring different worldviews to the discussion table. It's also a challenge to have an open discussion about miracles when a skeptical worldview can lead to impossible demands. We saw a wild example showing that extreme skepticism can drive rational people to make irrational decisions. We need to realize that science and miracles can coexist. They are not mutually exclusive. Also, there is an overlap between the realms of science and miracles because scientific inquiry can be used for testable miracle claims. I also shared about my own background and worldview, which includes the view that God can work via natural or supernatural methods. Okay, I don't want these episodes to get too long, so I'm going to stop here for now. I needed to lay some groundwork, but next time I'll present some evidence. Stay tuned. Thank you for accepting Priscilla's invitation. Join us next time for part 3B of the Jesus Identity series, which continues the topic of supernatural evidence. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others. May we no longer be infants tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching. Let us become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ.